Let me be upfront with you about something before we even get started. I do not traffic in rumors. I do not recycle gossip from Twitter threads and dress it up as insider information. What I am about to walk you through today took time, took sourcing, and took a level of patience that most channels covering this story simply do not have. Because the easy version of this story is the one you have already seen: the headlines, the comment sections, the reaction videos. That is not what this is. What this is the full picture. The institutional picture. The kind of picture that only becomes visible when you stop watching the cast and start watching the network. And what that picture shows right now, in this moment, regarding Darcey Silva and her future at TLC, is something that nobody in this space has put together the way I am about to put it together for you today. Stay with me. Every single word of this matters. If this kind of deep dive content is what you come here for, and if you want to be in the room when the next piece of this story breaks, hit that like button right now and subscribe to the tell-all tapes. We do not do clickbait. We do the work. Now, let's get into it. To understand what is happening with Darcey Silva at TLC right now, you have to understand what Darcey Silva actually is to that network. Not what she thinks she is, not what her fans believe she is, but what she functionally represents on a spreadsheet in a development meeting. Because that distinction is everything. And it is a distinction that Darcey, for all of her charisma and all of her cultural footprint, has never seemed to fully grasp. And that gap in understanding is precisely how we got here. Darcey Silva did not just appear on 90 Day Fiancé. She became, over the course of several seasons and one massively successful spin-off, a kind of living shorthand for an entire genre. When people who have never watched a single episode of reality television do an impression of a reality TV star, the wine glass, the crying in the car, the FaceTime argument in the airport, the dramatic declaration that she deserves better they are, without knowing it, doing a Darcey impression. She did not just participate in 90-day culture. She generated the vocabulary of it. The memes, the reaction videos, the commentary channels, and yes, channels exactly like this one grew audiences in no small part because Darcey Silva was consistently, reliably, and almost artistically compelling television. She helped build this genre into what it is today. She was a foundational piece of a format that turned TLC from a network people sort of remembered into a network people absolutely had to watch. And that matters. That contribution is real. Which is precisely why what I am about to tell you carries the kind of irony that you usually only find in a very well-written drama. Because the exact behaviors that made her the most watchable person on that network, the volatility, the emotional transparency, the inability to walk away from a conflict, those same behaviors are what has the executives at TLC asking a question that, even 2 years ago, would have seemed almost unthinkable. Is Darcey Silva more trouble than she is worth? That question is being asked. Not hypothetically. Not in a comment section. In rooms. Actual rooms with actual decision makers, with actual contracts on the table. And the fact that the question is being asked at all is the story. Because in television, once that question enters the room, it does not leave quietly. Now, I want to be precise about something here, because precision is what separates this channel from the dozens of others that will cover this story with far less care. I am not telling you that Darcey Silva has been fired. I am not telling you her show has been canceled. What I am telling you is that the internal conversation about her future at the network has escalated to a level that should concern anyone who is genuinely invested in what happens to her, and that the shape of that conversation reveals something about the entertainment industry that goes far beyond one person's contract status. Here is where it starts to get genuinely complicated. When Darcey and Stacey got their own spin-off, it looked from the outside like the ultimate validation. Your own show. Your own title card. Your own narrative arc, not filtered through the lens of whichever man you happen to be in a relationship with at the time. The spin-off was framed both by TLC's marketing and by Darcey herself as an elevation, a promotion. And in certain ways, it was more airtime, more visibility, more opportunity to build a brand that extended beyond a supporting role in someone else's love story. But here is what more airtime actually means when you are a talent with a specific kind of energy. More airtime means more footage. More footage means more hours of material that the production team, the editors, the standards team, and the legal team all have to sit with. And the math on that changes very quickly when the footage being generated is not just dramatic, which is fine. That is the product, but when it starts generating conversations in departments that are not supposed to be involved in a reality show about twin sisters from Connecticut. There is an invisible line in reality television. Most people who watch the genre sense it exists without being able to articulate exactly where it is. Producers know exactly where it is. Network executives know exactly where it is. And what separates the talent who survives long-term from the talent who becomes a cautionary tale is whether they can stay on the right side of that line. On one side of the line, you are an asset. You are difficult, you are messy, you are expensive, you are emotionally volatile, but you are a known quantity. You are manageable chaos. Networks are extraordinarily comfortable with manageable chaos. They have entire teams built to monetize manageable chaos. On the other side of that line, you are a liability. And a liability is not just someone who causes drama on camera. A liability is someone whose presence on the network creates problems that cannot be solved in the edit bay. Legal problems, PR problems, advertiser problems, internal culture problems. When talent crosses from one side of that line to the other, the network does not announce it. They do not send a memo. They schedule meetings. They pull contracts. They have conversations behind closed doors while everything on the public-facing side continues to look completely normal. The talent is often the last to know that the ground has shifted underneath them. And Darcey, if the information reaching me is accurate, has not just been approaching that line for the past 2 seasons. She has been sprinting toward it. Now, I want to give you something concrete because I know how easy it is for this kind of analysis to start feeling abstract. Here is a specific thing. During the filming of a recent segment, I am going to be deliberately imprecise about the timing here because my sourcing on this requires a level of discretion I intend to honor if there was an on-set situation. A situation involving talent, members of the production staff, and a dispute over creative direction. That much is not unusual. Disputes over creative direction happen on every reality set, every single day. Talent pushes back on producers. Producers push back on talent. That is normal friction in an inherently artificial environment. What was not normal about this particular situation is how it was resolved. Or more accurately, which department got involved in resolving it. It did not go legal. That would actually be the more manageable version of events, because legal disputes have a process and a resolution pathway. This went to standards. Network standards. And I want to make sure you understand what that distinction means, because it is everything. When standards gets involved in a production situation during filming not in post, not in the editing room, not during a compliance review of finished content, but during the actual active filming of a show that is a significant escalation. That involvement is documented. It goes into a talent file. It becomes part of the official record of how that talent engaged with the production process. And that record follows a talent through every subsequent conversation that network has about them. It does not expire. It does not get forgotten. It sits in a file that gets pulled out exactly when a contract comes up for renewal and someone in the room asks, "Has there been anything notable with this talent?" That is not speculation. That is how every major American broadcast and cable network operates. And if you understand that system, then you understand why this specific incident, whatever the details that I am not at liberty to share, is not just a piece of drama. It is a data point. And it is the data point that reportedly moved the internal conversation about Darcey Silva from ongoing concern to active discussion at the executive level. Here is something else I want you to sit with, because I think it is the piece that most commentary on Darcey misses entirely, even from people who genuinely study this space. The financial reality of a TLC exit is something that Darcey may be dramatically underestimating. And I use the word dramatically both literally and figuratively. Darcey Silva's income is not just a salary from TLC. It is an ecosystem. The sponsored content deals, the the appearance fees, the brand partnership inquiries, the speaking invitations, the podcast bookings, the merchandise opportunities, all of it, every single revenue stream is downstream of one thing, the TLC logo. That logo is the credential. It is the thing that makes a brand email her management instead of 100 other influencers who also have strong Instagram numbers and a dedicated fan base. The logo says, this person has network-level validation. This person has survived the rigorous process of being cast, filmed, edited, and broadcast by a major American television network. This person is, by definition, a cultural entity worth paying for. The moment that logo is no longer attached to her name in the present tense, the moment she becomes a former TLC star rather than a current TLC star, the entire ecosystem recalibrates. Not collapse, necessarily, but recalibrates. The tier of brand partnership changes. The appearance fee conversation changes. The media booking priority changes. In this industry, there is a very specific and very limited earning window associated with the title of former reality star, and it closes faster than anyone who has not lived through it fully anticipates. She would need, essentially immediately and in parallel with whatever is happening with TLC, a plan B that could generate the kind of income she has publicly displayed as her lifestyle. And right now, that plan B is not visible. At least not at the required scale. I have been watching Darcey Silva's on-camera behavior for a long time. Not just watching it as entertainment, which it undeniably is, but watching it analytically. As a case study in something. And the character element that keeps surfacing, the one that is most professionally consequential, is a specific and consistent pattern in how she receives negative feedback. In season after season, across multiple relationships and multiple narrative contexts, Darcey has not once, and I mean this, I have gone back and looked demonstrated on camera a capacity to hear a critical observation about her behavior without immediately converting it into something it is not. Every critique becomes jealousy. Every expression of concern becomes someone trying to dim her light. Every producer note, every suggestion from a partner, every moment where someone in her life attempts to reflect something difficult back to her becomes, in her framing, an attack to be defended against rather than information to be considered. She reframes criticism as persecution with a speed and a consistency that is genuinely striking when you watch for it. Now, as a human behavior, this is not unusual. A lot of people do this. It is a protective reflex, and it is actually quite understandable when you consider the kind of public scrutiny she has lived under for the better part of a decade. But in a professional context, specifically in the context of a working relationship with a television network and a production team, this reflex is extraordinarily costly. Because production teams talk to each other. They talk between seasons. They talk between shows. They talk at industry events. And the word that travels fastest in those conversations is not difficult. Difficulty is expected. Difficulty is priced in. The word that travels fastest, the one that has actual professional consequences, is undirectable. A talent who cannot receive direction cannot be shaped, cannot be corrected, cannot be moved from one version of themselves to a version that serves the project better. And a talent who cannot be directed is a talent who becomes, over time, a liability regardless of how compelling their footage is. I want to make a prediction here. And I want to be on record making it, so that when it happens, and I believe it will happen, you can come back to this video and see that someone saw it coming. If and when Darcey Silva addresses this TLC situation publicly, and she will, because she always does, here is exactly how it will unfold. She will be emotional. There will be tears. She will talk about her daughters and what she has sacrificed for her career. She will use the word journey. She will say something about knowing her worth and not letting anyone dim her shine. She will say she has so much exciting stuff coming that she can't wait to share. Her core fan base will respond exactly as they always do: love, support, queen energy, we stand with you. And that response is genuine, by the way. Her audience loves her. That is real. But there is another portion of the audience, The people who have been watching carefully, who have followed not just the drama, but the pattern, and they will notice something in her statement that will not be there. Ownership. Accountability. Any acknowledgement, however small, that her own choices and her own behavior contributed in any way to the situation she is describing. That absence will be the most revealing thing about the entire statement. Not what she says, what she cannot bring herself to say. And that brings me to something I think about every time I analyze a situation like this one. The thematic irony at the center of Darcey Silva's story, the genuine, layered, literary irony of it, is in the tension between the identity she has publicly constructed and the reality of how that identity was built. She has said, on multiple occasions, in multiple different contexts, that she is building her own empire, that she is an independent woman, that she does not need anyone to validate her, that her value is intrinsic and not conditional on anyone else's opinion of her. And I want to be clear, I believe she means it when she says it. I do not think it is performance. I think she genuinely holds that belief about herself, which makes the contradiction all the more poignant. Because every brick in the so-called empire, the visibility, the audience, the brand partnerships, the cultural footprint, the income, every single brick was laid using TLC's platform, TLC's cameras, TLC's distribution, and TLC's built-in audience of millions of viewers who would never have encountered Darcey Silva otherwise. That is not an empire. That is a remarkably successful tenant improvement. She built something real inside a building she does not own. And when the landlord begins discussing whether to renew the lease, suddenly the woman who built her identity around needing nobody finds herself in a position where she needs this meeting more than almost anything. That is not a criticism. That is the structure of the entertainment industry, and it traps people far more prepared than Darcey Silva. But it does mean that the leverage in these conversations sits overwhelmingly on one side of the table. And it is not her side. I also want to talk about something that does not get discussed enough in the coverage of this situation, which is the network's own dilemma here. Because TLC is not holding all the cards in the way you might assume. They have a problem too. A specific, uncomfortable, double-bind kind of problem. If they keep Darcey on if the contract gets renewed and the show continues there making an institutional statement, they're saying, with their platform and their resources, that the full picture of what has happened over the last several seasons represents an acceptable standard for talent on their network. They're absorbing the PR exposure, the advertiser conversations, the standards documentation, the internal cultural signal it sends to every other cast member who is watching how this gets handled. If they cut her if the spin-off ends and her contract is not renewed, they are triggering an exit that will be anything but quiet. TLC's legal and communications teams know exactly what a Darcey Silva public breakup looks like. They have watched her process every other ending in her life in real time, on camera, with a wine glass in her hand and a camera crew nearby. They know she will not release a brief statement thanking them for the opportunity. They know the Instagram lives are coming. They know the podcast appearances are coming. They know the emotional, detailed, audience-facing version of events is coming, and they know it will generate headlines, and they know those headlines will require responses. And they know all of that is expensive and disruptive in ways that go well beyond whatever her contract is worth. She will not go quietly. And they know that. And that specific knowledge is exactly why these conversations are happening in boardrooms instead of press releases. Because right now, TLC is not deciding what to do. They're deciding how to manage whatever they decide to do. And that is a very different kind of conversation. So where does that leave us? Where does that leave Darcey? Let me tell you exactly where it leaves her, and I want you to pay attention to this part, because this is the piece where the surface-level coverage of this story consistently gets wrong. The people who are reducing this to is she getting fired or not are asking the wrong question. The right question, the one that actually illuminates what is happening and what it means is this. Who, right now, in the rooms where this is being decided, is going to stand up and make the case for Darcey Silva? Think about that for a moment. Not who loves her. Not who supports her publicly. Not who comments on her posts. Who has the institutional standing, the industry relationships, and the personal investment to walk into a room full of network executives and production company leadership and say, I am telling you, this talent is worth the complexity. I am vouching for her. I am putting my credibility on the line for this. Look at the people in her immediate orbit. Stacey, her sister, her closest ally, the person who has been by her side through every season and every storyline. Stacey is navigating her own contractual situation right now. She is not in a position of institutional leverage. She cannot walk into that room and change the temperature of the conversation. Her mother, who is a genuinely warm and supportive presence in both of their lives, has no industry standing. She is a loving parent, not a power broker. The fan base, and again, the fan base is real, the love is real, the engagement numbers are real, and has no seat at that table. Fan support is a metric that factors into decisions, but it does not override the judgment of a standards department or a legal team or an executive whose primary obligation is to the network's advertiser relationships and institutional reputation. And the men from her relationships, the ones who would in a different version of this story be her partners in the truest sense, are conspicuously, almost symbolically, absent from this particular chapter. When the meeting that determines the next chapter of your professional life happens in a room you are not allowed to be in, you need advocates. People who will fight for you when you cannot fight for yourself. People whose voice carries weight with the people making the decision. And right now, looking at Darcey's situation as clearly and as honestly as I can, her advocate list is thin. Dangerously thin for the scale of the conversation being had about her. And this is not about being cruel. I want to be very clear about that. This is not about piling on. This is about understanding how the machinery of this industry actually works, because most of the content covering Darcey Silva treats her story as purely personal as a relationship story, as a family story, as an emotional journey. And it is all of those things. But it is also a professional story, an institutional story. And the institutional dimension is the one that is going to determine what her life looks like 18 months from now, regardless of how many people love her on Instagram. Now I want to talk about something that I think is genuinely underappreciated in discussions about reality television talent and their long-term viability. There is a concept in the industry, not an official term, more of a working framework that people in development and talent management use that I would describe as the management overhead calculation. Every talent on a network's roster requires a certain amount of management overhead. Producers manage their expectations. PR teams managing their public statements. Legal teams managing their contracts and any incidents that arise. Standards teams reviewing their footage. Communications teams fielding media inquiries about them. All of that is real labor. All of that is a real cost. And the network is constantly, whether consciously or not, running a calculation. Does the revenue and ratings value this talent generates justify the management overhead they require? For most of TLC's talent, this calculation is simple and favorable. The talent brings in viewers, the overhead is manageable, everybody wins. But for a small number of talents, the ones who are exceptional draws, but also exceptionally complex to manage, that calculation becomes genuinely difficult. And when the overhead starts growing faster than the ratings value, the math begins to shift. Not because anyone has made a decision. Not because anyone has decided they dislike the talent or want them gone. The math just shifts. And shifted math over time becomes shifted priorities. And shifted priorities become the meetings we have been talking about. The question I keep returning to when I think about Darcey's situation is, does she know? Does she actually know the shape of the conversation happening about her? Not the rumors, not the fan speculation, not the thick pieces of the actual institutional conversation. My honest assessment is that she probably has a sense that something is different. Talent always does. There are signals the way calls get returned, the enthusiasm level in certain conversations, the things that used to be offered that are no longer being offered. Talent reads those signals, even when no one is being direct with them. But having a sense that something is different and fully understanding the depth and the stakes of the conversation are two very different things. And the gap between those two levels of awareness is where the most costly mistakes get made. Because if you sense that something is shifting, but you do not fully understand the scale of it, your instinct is to do more of what made you successful. More presence, more content, more emotional transparency, more of the behaviors that built your audience in the first place. And for someone whose professional identity is built on a specific kind of emotional volatility and public engagement, doing more of what made you successful might be precisely the thing that accelerates the institutional concern rather than alleviating it. It is a feedback loop that is very easy to enter and very difficult to exit. And the people who successfully navigate it are almost always the ones who had someone in their corner who could see the loop clearly and tell them the truth about what they were watching. I want to address the audience for a moment, the genuine Darcey fans who are watching this video, because I know you are here and I want to say something to you directly. I understand the instinct to dismiss content like this as negativity, as hate, as people who do not understand her or who are rooting for her to fail. I want you to know that is not what this is. What I am doing is taking Darcey's professional story seriously enough to analyze it honestly. The channels that only tell you what you want to hear, that it is all going to be fine, that TLC would never, that the fans will save her, those channels are not respecting your intelligence, and they are not respecting hers. Honest analysis is not the same as hostility. Sometimes it is the most respectful thing you can offer someone. Now let me bring this to where I think it is ultimately headed, because this is the part one I've been building toward from the beginning of this video, and it is the part one think matters most regardless of what ultimately happens with the contract. Television has a memory. This is something that people outside the industry do not fully appreciate, and it is something that people inside the industry never forget. Everything that happens in a production context, every standard involvement, every legal conversation, every documented incident, every internal email with capital letters in the subject line, all of it becomes part of a record. And that record travels. It gets referenced in future negotiations. It gets mentioned in casting conversations. It circulates through the network of producers and development executives who all know each other, who all work with each other across different shows and different networks, who all share information in the way that any professional community shares information about shared challenges. Even if Darcey Silva survives this particular moment, and I am genuinely not telling you she will not, even if the contract gets renewed and the spin-off continues and the cameras keep rolling, the fact that the question was asked at the executive level changes the fundamental nature of her relationship with the network. Permanently. She is no longer, in that institutional framing, a guaranteed asset. She is now a calculated risk. A question that was answered in her favor this time, but a question that will be asked again next renewal cycle, and the cycle after that, with a progressively lower threshold for what tips the answer the other way. In a different era of television, a talent with Darcey's cultural footprint could absorb that shift and sustain a long career anyway, because the options were limited and the audience was captive. But we are not in that era. We are in an era where TLC has more content than it has ever had, where the streaming competition for reality programming is genuinely ferocious, where a new cast member can go from complete unknown to trending in 3 episodes, where the network has more leverage over individual talent than at almost any point in the reality genre's history. In that environment, calculated risks have a shorter patience threshold. They get discontinued more quickly, more quietly, and with less institutional guilt than they used to. And I think that is the piece that Darcey and honestly, a lot of long-running reality talent has not fully internalized. The math of this industry has changed. The power distribution has changed. The tenure that used to protect a franchise player now protects them less than it did, because the network has more alternatives and the audience has more options. Loyalty in this business has always been conditional, but the conditions are stricter now than they have ever been. And the talent who thrive in this new landscape are not necessarily the most entertaining. They are the ones who understand the institutional game clearly enough to play it strategically, rather than emotionally. There is a version of Darcey Silva's next chapter that is genuinely exciting. That is the version where she looks at this moment, this specific, uncomfortable, high-stakes moment, and uses it as the inflection point it actually is. Where she makes different choices. Where she builds the kind of team around her that can translate her very real cultural equity into a professional trajectory that is not entirely dependent on one network's decisions. Where she develops the plan B that does not currently exist at the required scale. Where she demonstrates, in the way that actually matters in institutional contexts, that she can operate as a professional who is valuable precisely because she is both compelling and manageable. That version exists. It is accessible. It requires things from her that she has not historically been willing to do, but it is not impossible. And there is the other version. The one where the pattern continues. Where the feedback loop does what feedback loops do. Where the institutional conversation that is currently behind closed doors eventually moves to a different kind of conversation, one that happens through agents and lawyers and carefully worded press releases about pursuing new opportunities. That version is also accessible. And it requires nothing from her, which is always the danger with the path of least resistance. I do not know which version is coming. Genuinely, I do not. And anyone who tells you they know with certainty is selling you something. What I know is that the choice point is real, and it is now, and the window for it does not stay open indefinitely. Moments like this one where there is still enough leverage on both sides that the outcome is genuinely negotiable are rarer and shorter than they appear from the outside. And how Darcey moves in the next few months, whether publicly or institutionally, will tell us a great deal about which version of this story we are actually watching. Here is the final thing I want to leave you with, and then I want to hear from you. Because I think this is the piece that gives this story its weight beyond the gossip, beyond the contract speculation, beyond the Darcey-specific details. What we are really watching in the Darcey Silva situation is something that plays out for a lot of people, in a lot of industries, in a lot of ways that have nothing to do with reality television. The collision between a public identity and an institutional reality. Between who someone has told the world they are and who they have to be when a room full of decision makers is evaluating whether to continue investing in them. Between the version of yourself you perform and the version of yourself you actually show up as when the cameras stop and the production team has to write their notes for the day. Most people navigate this collision privately, without millions of followers watching, without their tears being immortalized in meme format, without their worst moments being replayed in reaction videos by strangers. Darcey has to navigate it in public. And as uncomfortable as that is, and it is genuinely uncomfortable to watch, even for people who are not particularly sympathetic to her, it is also the thing that makes her story matter in a way that goes beyond whether the spin-off gets renewed. Because she is, in her extremely specific and chaotic and wineglass-heavy way, working through something universal. The question of whether the person you have been is compatible with the future you want. Whether the behaviors that got you here are the behaviors that keep you here. Whether you can hear that question clearly enough, and honestly enough, to answer it with something other than defensiveness. Those are not reality television questions. Those are human questions. And that is why people keep watching. Not just for the drama. For the mirror. So here is what I am asking you to do right now. If this analysis added something to how you understand the story, if it gave you a framework or a detail or a perspective that the surface level coverage was not giving you, show this channel that it matters. Leave a comment below telling me what you think happens next. Does Darcey's contract get renewed? Does she make the pivot? Does she prove the executives wrong, or does this become the chapter where things shifted and nobody announced it? I genuinely want to know where you think this goes, because this audience is one of the most analytically sharp communities covering this genre, and I learn from your comments every single video. Hit that like button if you stayed with this all the way through. That tells the algorithm this kind of deep dive content is what people actually want, and it gets this video in front of the people who need to see it. Subscribe to the tell-all tapes if you are not already here, because the next video in this series is going to go somewhere that this one deliberately did not, and you do not want to come back 3 weeks from now and find out you missed it. Turn on the notification bell. Actually turn it on, because this channel does not post filler content to stay on your feed, which means when we do post, it counts. I am going to keep watching this situation. I am going to keep sourcing it carefully. And I am going to keep bringing you the version of the story that respects your intelligence enough to tell you what is actually happening, rather than what is comfortable to hear. That is the deal this channel makes with its audience. And I do not intend to break it. Stay locked in. The next chapter of the story is coming faster than Darcey's team would like. And when it does, the tell-all tapes will be exactly where you need to be.